My name is Noura. I'm from Institute of Multi-Track Diplomacy. My question is concerning the human right. Both of you have mentioned the human right can be used as a tool. Do you think changing the system from the inside can be used to stop the nuclear enrichment from Iran? And this will help the trust relationship between Iran and the U.S. government and the EU or not? Because if you are working within the system, this will deteriorate the condition with the relationship with the Iranian government at the same time, conceded with the sanctions that you are putting on the government. So can it be as a tool or not? Or this will deteriorate the condition with Iran?
Did you follow the question?
I think I did.
I think so.
Do you want me to repeat the question?
It's okay, I got it. Actually, I don't think human rights should be used as a tool. Human rights is an end in and of itself. Pursuing and putting pressure and using other type of instruments to make sure that Iran lives up to its obligations, legal obligations, to uphold human rights is extremely important. I mean, we've been using the term of nuclear obligations for quite some time now. Iran also has obligations on the human rights front because it's a signatory to many of these different treaties. So I think not speaking about this issue, not putting this on the agenda is unhelpful. Now, is it an easy issue to address? No, it is not. It is a tremendously, tremendously difficult and complicated issue that brings in cultural factors and a whole lot of different things. But bottom line is, if the United States is ignoring this issue, I think it will risk losing a strategic asset that it has in Iran, which it frankly does not have in many other parts in that region. And that is the fact that the population in Iran tends to have, in spite of all differences, a generally positive view of the United States. And this was something that really came to the fore last year. After the elections, after the abuses, was the United States going to talk or not talk with the Iranians? One administration official told me that he described it as the first moral moment or something like that for the administration of what to do. The argument that prevailed apparently was that if they can manage to get the process started, they will have a better ability to address that issue. I hope, though, that as we go forward, we don't sacrifice human rights in Iran for the sake of a quick nuclear deal. And we certainly don't sacrifice human rights just to be able to get sanctions, because we fear that if we ask for support on the human rights front in the international community, we cannot get support on the sanctions front on the international community. And I'm afraid that that may have happened.
I think that's right. I agree with Trita. We should support human rights and democracy in Iran, full stop. Not because it's a tool, not because it's an instrument for some other end, but in an end in itself. But I think that we can also say that it is manifestly in U.S. interest to support human rights and democracy, whether in Iran or elsewhere. We want to see governments that act on behalf of their people and not on behalf of a narrow clique. And unfortunately, what we see in Iran right now is a regime that doesn't act in its people's best interests.
All right, we've got a question from the Jerusalem Post. Questions for both Trita and Michael. Let me start with Michael because I can read this question. Do you agree that the lack of trust, particularly due to the specific P5+1 countries at the negotiating table, has been the stumbling block for engagement? That's from Michael. And for Trita, do you agree with Michael that Iran wants a nuclear weapon and that rapprochement is a threat? Can't totally understand.
I'm trying to create a fight here, no?
I'll tell you that I don't think that lack of trust is the main stumbling block. Trust is developed through successful negotiations. It's not. I think it's unrealistic to expect that negotiators will develop trust in each other before they've met. And if you look at the history of Iranian relations with other countries, Trita mentioned that Iran doesn't have good relations with any of the countries in the P5+1. If you take the Iran-Russia relationship, Russia in the early part of the 20th century essentially controlled one half of Iran. Britain controlled the other half. Russia shelled the Majlis, essentially ending the constitutional revolution in Iran. They were brutal in the way they treated Iran at that time. And yet, now we think of Russia as a country which is a partner with Iran. Iran, like all countries, acts, I think, based on its calculations of its interests, not based on emotions or history. Those obviously play a role in sort of subtle and complex ways. But I think that if Iran saw it as being in its interest, it would sit down and negotiate with the United States.
The other issue was if they're seeking a nuclear weapon.
Right.
My assessment would be that I think the Iranians are pursuing, similar to what the Shah was pursuing, he wants to have the weapons option. He wants to have it because of various geostrategic factors. I don't think we can say with certainty that a decision has been made to get the weapon. I am afraid, however, that we may be moving closer to that for various reasons. One being that the constellation of the Iranian government itself has changed drastically in the last year alone. So some of the conclusions that we had last year about what their intentions are and what their end objectives are need to be reassessed and see if they're still true. It's a very difficult process because we may not really know how this constellation has changed and what the new components of it are. But at the same time, I would say that one of the surest ways of ensuring that the Iranians would make the decision to go for a nuclear bomb is to bomb Iran. In such a scenario, I think the debate there would end, and we have seen historical precedent that after such an event, various things can happen, including that they can withdraw from the NPT, invoking Article 10. And in the case of Iraq, that seemed to have been a tripling, a quadrupling of the nuclear budget. I think that if the ultimate objective is to make sure that we prevent proliferation and we prevent a nuclear Iran, bombing Iran seems to be the worst option according to any metric.
Do we have any other questions from the press? Okay, if not, you have are you press? Okay.
Hi, I'm David Ivanovich with Argus Media. Michael, you mentioned that the sanctions seem to be having some bite now. Were you specifically referring to the importation of gasoline and other refined products, or can you talk about what specifically you think is manifested in Iran right now that showing that these sanctions are having some effect?
Frankly, I don't know what the effect exactly the gas import ban is. I haven't seen personally evidence. Others may have that. I think, though, that if you look at the range of sanctions which were recently imposed, which really they build on previous sanctions, the banking sanctions, shipping sanctions, restrictions on Iran's arms dealings, I think that those all do have some bite. Particularly, I think the financial sanctions and maybe in the future the shipping sanctions. They really do make it more difficult for Iran to engage in the kind of, especially the individuals in the regime, to engage in the kind of business that they otherwise would.